Just taking another look at the DSM-5, at this point, you're probably starting to see that Cortés has a real issue with authority, and let's talk about a person who wants to be their own boss. So fast forward a little bit. After conquering the Aztecs, Cortés is now appointed governor of New Spain by Charles V, whom Cortés has spent his entire career writing letters to, basically lying about everything he's doing, because he's trying to play the victim in all of this. People like Velázquez, he would say, these are just haters, and they're out to get him. So meanwhile, Cortés's wife, because yes, he was married this entire time to Catalina, shows up in 1522, much to his dismay. By this point, Cortés has a lot of illegitimate children with Aboriginal women. Go figure. The estimate is around 10 of them at this point. So he knew he was capable of impregnating a woman, yet Catalina never bore him a child. Thus, Catalina died under mysterious circumstances on November the 1st, 1522. And he was accused of her murder, but the investigation fell short. Getting rid of your wife, not that I can verify this, does seem to be a very good measure for the criteria of the disorder we're talking about in question, if you know what I mean. Okay, now for something that you probably noticed I haven't really touched on. And this is the brutality of Hernán Cortés and the conquistadors in general. Something that's actually known as the Black Legend. This is a very long piece of history to describe. I'm going to try and summarize it. So back in that time, there was a bit of a propaganda piece being written by people in France and Great Britain, trying to portray the Spanish as being the most barbaric and brutal murderers of the time. They go as far as saying things like the Spanish are cutting up Aboriginal children and then selling the meat back to their parents, and just really messed up stories. Truth be told, the French, the British were doing almost the same thing the Spanish were doing, although even I have to admit, from what you read from primary source documents, the Spanish do seem to have gone a little bit overboard. And I mean, just let's look at the cases of Christopher Columbus or Francisco Pizarro. They did the exact same things as Cortés, and there are atrocities. So I'm going to go a little bit more into this. So Cortés, he was very effective at the divide and conquer strategy. His initial campaign was built on obtaining Aboriginal allies, smaller tribes that were at war or disliked the Triple Alliance, aka the Aztecs. So he got them all to attack these Aztecs. One can argue that Cortés did butcher many Aboriginals, and I'm not arguing against this, but his Aboriginal allies were in no way clean of this. Most of them were responsible for the atrocities, as we're going to see. So just to highlight a few events that occurred. In 1519, Cortés and his forces of 1,000 Aboriginal allies, and I know I'm going to butcher this word, so I'll put it in the subtitles. The Tlaxcaltecan, I'm so sorry, marched on Colula, the second largest city, and decided to instill fear in the Aztec people. So as an example, and also under fear of the Aboriginal treachery going on at the time, just to summarize the events, he came into this town and the nobles were actually treating him quite nice, but his Aboriginal allies were telling him that they were secretly planning to kill them all and that they were getting pots ready to boil them and eat them, and there were stakes in the ground and all sorts of stuff. This is probably lies, because his allies just wanted to kill everyone. So, regardless of this, Cortés felt like he was going to make a big show of it, so he massacred thousands of unarmed civilians and burnt most of the city. His Aboriginal allies did most of the killing, and they were quite savage. There's actually written work from this event in particular, and it's very enlightening as to how these tribes were fighting each other. Later on, when he was attacking the Aztecs, he met Montezuma II, who took him in peacefully, and promptly Cortés took him hostage. So Cortés at this point is secretly in control of the Aztec Empire, using Montezuma as a showman, when in fact it's Cortés doing all the orders. And while he's manipulating him, which honestly is not something unique to Cortés, I just want to bring up slowly, Francisco de Pizarro, he did the exact same thing, so this isn't a special case. A lot of other people did this hostage situation. And a lot would argue that Montezuma might have played a role in this himself. There could have been some dealings going on because this is a point of contest with scholars. But anyways, something to highlight is the death of Montezuma. Cortés alleged that the king was stoned to death by his own people because he was putting down a rebellion. I personally don't believe this. A lot of scholars believe that Cortés just killed Montezuma because he wasn't useful anymore, and things fell through. Now, as for the conquest of Tenochtitlan, it involved around 40,000 Aztec civilian deaths, or up to 200,000. It's up to debate. There's really no way to tell the numbers. And somewhere in the figure of 90,000 to 300,000 Aztec warriors were killed. Cortés apparently lost around 860 Spanish and around 20,000 of his Aboriginal allies. Now, despite this old myth that people seem to have of Hernán Cortés defeating millions of Aztecs with a handful or 500 Spaniards, this is completely a lie. Cortés had something in the figures of 200,000 Aboriginal allies, and there's no way he would have conquered the Aztecs with the numbers he had, guns or not. The Triple Alliance was really abusing everyone around them. So if you weren't an Aztec and you were one of these native Aboriginal communities, you were being taxed, your children were being stolen, your people were being stolen to be sacrificed. They had every reason to rebel. And they were rebelling before Hernán came into this. He was just smart enough to use this against the Aztecs. If you want to look at the brutality of the Aztecs, I would recommend you watch a funny film by Mel Gibson, Apocalyptico, or something, I don't remember how it was called. Anyways, it's a terrible movie. It's very inaccurate, but it does show you a little bit of what was going on. One other small little event I'd like to bring up is when Cortés tortured a man who is the cousin to Montezuma II. His name was Cuauhtémoc, another name that I probably butchered. I'm very sorry about this. Anyways, it's actually a very famous event, especially in Latin America. Cortés allegedly had burnt this man over a fire pit, putting his feet over it, demanding to know where all the gold of the Aztec was buried, because he believed that this man was responsible for getting everyone to hide it. The man was actually executed, never giving him the coordinates. There's a lot of stories about what he said, and it's something along the lines of, "Oh, I had the people bury it, so you'll never find it, you pig." It's actually a quite funny thing to say. So I'd like to just bring up that obviously Cortés was responsible for mass murders, mutilations, rapes, everything that you've read about the conquistador history. But I don't find that specifically makes him a psychopath, as many others were doing the exact same thing at the exact same time. Look into the history of Christopher Columbus. Look at the history of Cuba at the beginnings, or Hispaniola, which is now the Dominican, and how they treated the Aboriginals. It was atrocious. Cortés was in no way unique in this character. His vigor and his machoism has resoundingly gone through history, but I highlighted more towards some of his personal traits that we know from written sources, such as his womanizing behavior. I mean, the guy actually got syphilis, and it stopped him from going on an expedition. And he broke his legs or something jumping up a balcony when he was having sex with someone's wife. It's quite a piece of history there. He had a huge problem with authority. And all these things do indicate your typical psychopath or someone who suffers from antisocial personality disorder. And just a side note, and I think it's a little petty to say, but if you have syphilis, it does cause you to have some certain psychological problems. And I don't know if anyone's actually looked into what involvement syphilis had with Cortés. Needless to say, to get more to a conclusion, there's a vast amount of history after the fall of the Aztecs in regards to Cortés, as he went on to explore more territories, especially in the California. He went back and forth from Spain, lying to the king, giving the king more of his riches, trying to impress the king, because he was trying to get his aggravated enemies to be kept at bay. Because Velázquez was still messing with him up until the guy's death. So eventually Cortés spent so much money and was in debt. So he returned to Mexico, and it was in Seville he died of pleurisy at the age of 62. And I was looking this up, it's an inflammation of the lungs. But there's also a note that he got dysentery at the same time, so I'm wondering maybe if he actually died from dysentery. But anyways, apparently it was inflammation of the lungs at 62. Now, a lot that's been written about Cortés is very biased, such as the letters to the king he wrote himself. These were complete lies. He was trying to just put himself in the victim position and get sympathy from the king, trying to make the king think that he was doing this all for the crown in Spain. And honestly, he was telling the king he was going to give him a lot of gold, of which he did. But he did hide how much gold he was holding, mind you. His private captain, López de Gomera, who wrote a lot about Hernán Cortés, actually never set foot in the Americas. He was simply told everything later on and wrote it. The conquistador, Diaz de Castillo, who was an eyewitness of most of the events, doesn't paint Cortés as the victim or hero that Cortés describes himself. He pretty much says that he was a brutal conquistador like the rest and did a lot of atrocities. I would also like to bring up something that I deeply read when writing this episode, the work by Bartolomé de las Casas, who was the author in English of a short account of the destruction of the Indies, which was an eyewitness account of the brutality of the conquistadors, and he particularly talked about Cortés a bit. From these works, there is a sharp description of Cortés personally being a vicious, ruthless, rather than noble hero, which is interesting because it was written at that time. Bartolome, had a unique perspective, and he kind of took the side of the Aboriginals when he was writing his works. He's a very interesting read, and I would recommend it, and I will put a link in the video. So, to conclude, an individual with this disorder lacks empathy. Check mark. He tends to be callous, inflated, and arrogant. This is feelings of the ordinary work to be beneath him. I would give him a great check mark for Hernán Cortés. They may display superficial charm and verbal facile. These individuals may be irresponsible and exploitive in their sexual relationships and may have a history of many sexual partners while never sustaining a monogamous relationship. I would say that Hernán Cortés deeply falls under this category, as not only did he sleep with a lot of women, contract syphilis, but he did so when he was married and probably killed his first wife. And then he married later on, but if you look at his family tree, man, this guy had a lot of illegitimate and legitimate children. Quite the womanizer. And lastly, I'll give a big check mark on the idea that he was a psychopath. I have to say, not being a clinical psychologist in any way, that would be very obvious to a real clinical psychologist that if you were to highlight a psychological disorder for this individual, it would probably be anti-personality disorder. So I hope you enjoyed this bizarre episode. I tried to change things up a bit, a little bit more comedy involved, especially when it comes to Hernán Cortés, because talking about such a brutal character is it's an interesting time, and researching him was honestly a lot of fun. I've done a lot of essays, especially at an undergrad level, researching Latin America and the Conquest period, and Hernán Cortés is just such a character. He really was this machoism figure, and the way that he went about, he was so brutal, and he honestly, it's as if he couldn't care less about authority. It's interesting how he was able to do everything he did. He should have been killed so many times or arrested. He was very lucky, I would say, very lucky in how he did everything. But needless to say, he was quite the psychopath. Raising that issue, I would like to just put forward some of the ideas I have in the future, just to keep the interest going, because I have a lot of projects I'd like to do for videos. Such as I've written here, yes, I'd like to do a video on Ernst Röhm of the Third Reich. Maybe I'll make a comparison into the idea that people have, these conspiracy theorists, that Hitler was gay. I just want to dispel this idea and bring up why this has come about, because I've done a lot of research on the Third Reich, and I honestly think that Ernst Röhm is a very interesting character. I'd also like to talk about Nero Claudius, Scipio Africanus in comparison to Julius Caesar, and I'm not sure if I'm going to do this one, but I've done a lot of research into the Bosnian genocide. I think this is quite an interesting piece, and I might also do a book review on something to do with the Bosnian genocide. I thank you for watching this video, and please, if you could, leave a like and subscribe, as I'm a very small channel, and I could use all the help I can get. This is MBS History.